started already when I was in preschool. I cannot say why exactly, but all of a sudden I got it in me that I didn't have a left arm. I am sure it is normal to some extent, I was after all extremely right-handed. My left arm was just this useless appendage that hung there limply, usually just a nuisance that would constantly get in the way. I'm pretty sure I at some point had control over it, that I could willfully move it, but as my conviction grew stronger, what little motoric functions were left, no pun intended, dwindled into obscurity. By middle school I didn't use it at all. I didn't acknowledge it at all. In my mind I only had one arm. I didn't even register it as a right arm, it was just arm. When people asked me if I was right or left-handed, I'd reply nonchalantly I'm just handed. When asked if we should make a left or right turn, I'd raise my eyebrows curiously and mumble a meaningless "that way." The very concept of having two distinctly different hands as a way of describing directions utterly lost on me. Because of this, let's call it a delusion, there were a lot of concepts lost on me. But I didn't mind it at first. I was just different. If people wanted to cling on to the absurd notion that having two awkwardly positioned semi-symbiotic appendages parallel to one another somehow was superior to having one perfectly aligned alpha arm, it was their loss. I'd just roll my eyes as they desperately tried to explain the theoretical advantages of dual-handed usage. What a bunch of weirdos. But when I started college things changed. I started getting this phantom pain in my left arm, or non-arm as I often would refer to it as when describing the sensation to my doctor. The first time I went to see him about it he just stood there blinking silently for several minutes, almost as if my complaint didn't register correctly. The second time he just sat there shaking his head. The third time he referred me to the campus counselor, and assured me that the phrase phantom pain wasn't applicable to my current situation. The counselor didn't offer much in the way of a solution, but suggested I'd stop calling it a non-arm. Maybe I should try alternate arm or other arm instead? Maybe there were some suppressed emotions surfacing, or possibly a long-forgotten trauma that needed revisiting. I should do some soul-searching, she said, and then I could come back and talk about my discoveries. She scribbled away in her pink notebook frantically, her alpha arm obviously a well-trained specimen. It was the first and last time I saw her. As the weeks went by, my phantom pain grew to a spectral torment. I couldn't go 5 minutes without wincing, and my tortured grunts would get me thrown out of lecture after lecture. I talked to my friends about it, and although they kept a straight face, I could tell they didn't take me seriously. I'd never bothered to mention my rather unique view on appendage distribution to them, simply because they wouldn't understand. I'd get the old "see a doctor, talk to a shrink, try cutting it and see if it hurts, how do you handle multiple cutlery and the likes," but nothing of any practical use. The only advice that held some sort of merit came from my friend Gladys, who suggested I should start keeping a dream journal. Weird stuff happened in our subconscious, she said, and sometimes it could reveal some hidden meaning. Devoid of any other viable solutions, I decided to follow her advice, and purchased a rather luxurious leather-bound notebook the very next day. I laid it ceremonially down upon my nightstand, along with a disappointingly dull, yet surprisingly expensive, pen, and tucked myself in for the old visit to Nod. I wasn't expecting much, mostly because I never really dreamt anything. I sort of dozed off and woke up, the time in between a great big blank nothing. And sure enough, I woke up exactly 8 hours after falling asleep with absolutely no memories of the event. But then I glanced at the notebook sleepily, and what I saw came completely out of left field, pun intended. It was a poem. Just a few stanzas. But the handwriting was elegant and exquisite, like something penned by an angel. I stared at it. At the pen resting in my non-arm. No. It couldn't have been. It was impossible. I yanked the pen from it furiously, turning my gaze to the poem before me. I must confess I feel forlorn. My being lost in sands of time. I failed to act except to mourn. Existence was my only crime. While the quality of the composition left a lot to be desired, I had to admit I was impressed, if just slightly unnerved. It was a soft cry for attention, and for the first time I almost felt like acknowledging its existence. But I was sure that given the chance, my right hand could do better. The next few nights I set out to prove that theory, leaving the notebook on the right side of the bed. But to my disappointment the pages remained empty, and I was forced to face reality. My non-hand wrote better poetry than my alpha hand. For weeks and months I kept the notebook away from my non-hand, I guess to punish it, or maybe to ignore its talents, or simply to deny its existence. But the phantom pain was excruciating, and some nights I would wake up drenched in sweat, the non-hand firmly gripping the alpha hand around the wrist, perhaps in an attempt to strangle it. It became increasingly apparent that it wouldn't let this notion of vigor go, So I was eventually forced to return the notebook, awaiting the result anxiously. As I had expected, I awoke to freshly written strands forming some manner of understandable message, but I couldn't find it in me to read them thoroughly. I suppose I dreaded the effect they would have on me, on my right hand, on my general way of life. So I tore out the pages after every night, letting the crumpled paper balls fill up my trash can like some egregious mountain of disappointment. The phantom pain came and went, but it remained manageable for the most part, so I made the mistake of just ignoring it. A terrible mistake. I woke up screaming, the pain shooting up my right arm so extreme that I nearly fainted the moment I regained consciousness. I don't know how, but somehow I had slept through most of it. It was like my non-hand, left hand, had taken control of my pain receptors, ignoring the torment just up until the point it wanted me to feel it. I looked down at the mangled mess that had once been my right hand, my alpha hand. The pen had torn into it ferociously, ripping the skin in ways I hadn't thought possible. Most of the forearm was a fleshly pulp, and the palm of my hand had several gaping holes. After the initial shock and horror, I managed to roll out of my now blood-covered bed, and soon enough the campus security came to my aid. If they'd been there just a minute later, I would probably have died from the blood loss. The arm couldn't be saved. The damage was so severe that they had to amputate it at the shoulder. My pleas, appeals and implorations sounded to deaf ears. They refused to take the left arm with it. This was my darkest night. It was like parting with my parents. Worse. It was like the most vital part of my life and existence had been ripped away, the void of the departure almost impossible to fill. To top it off, it would seem I had to spend the remainder of my years accompanied by its, physically and metaphorically, heartless murderer. We never truly got along, my left arm and me, even after the removal of the Alpha 1. I would allow it to write poems again, and I would read and interpret them just to please it. I would also send a few of them in for publication in various magazines and prose collections, but they were never accepted. I think the rejection slowly but surely got to it, and the poems were getting darker and more depressing, by now having some real Sylvia Plath-esque quality to them. But I was never truly worried. Not really. Not until this morning. I tore out the page and placed it neatly upon my desk, as per my usual ritual, and started reading it. Existence is pain, torment and hell. Trapped in a foul, stinking, rotting shell. Thus there is no meaning, life is a lie. As soon as you're sleeping, we're both gonna die. After shaking my head at the banality of the message and subpar flow of the lines, I came to realize the terrible implications of it. There is no way around this, and I know it. I've never been able to talk it out of anything. If it wants us dead, it will see to it, end of story. So I have to do it, guys. There's just no other option. I will have to find a way to sever my remaining arm.